I always really, really enjoy talking to Trita. He's the executive vice president of the Quincy Institute. He's the author of three really excellent books about the relationship between the US and Israel and Iran. One of the reasons that I really appreciate Trita is I think he lives in an unusual space where he's kind of close enough to the mainstream foreign policy debate in the United States to have his voice heard, but he's also fundamentally a critic of it. So he plays that kind of bridging role, which I think there are not very many people actually in Washington to really do that. I think Matt Duss does it in a little bit of a way, but we don't really have enough people who are actually making a fundamental critique of American foreign policy, but also can get into a room where they might actually be listened to.
I hope you just didn't jinx me right there.
So, Trita, it seems like, to use a schoolyard metaphor, Israel keeps punching Iran in the nose and punching Hezbollah in the nose, and Iran doesn't really seem to be punching back. Hezbollah is punching back a little bit, and maybe they tried and were unable to, but the Israeli strategy seems to be very aggressive. And the Iran strategy seems to be some kind of, I don't know, there was that old boxing metaphor like rope-a-dope. You just let the other guy keep swinging. I don't want to make it sound like I think that Iran is a benign actor in the Middle East or in the world, far from it. But they seem to be having a very different strategy than Israel, and that I think a lot of Americans have been assuming. So maybe you can just help us understand that.
I think you're putting your finger on something very important, because the image that is presented by Iran, which is that it is a suicidal, irrational state seeking the destruction of Israel, doesn't seem to really match what we're seeing right now. And again, it's not to paint them as a benign actor, but I think it is fair to say that they have been quite restrained in face of not only a large number of Israeli attacks, but also extremely embarrassing ones. I mean, that really put the Iranians to shame, and the idea that they can protect themselves and some of their allies in the region. I think it all goes down to a deeper question, which is, are the Iranians actually really looking to destroy Israel? Certainly some of their rhetoric gives that impression. Some of them say that outright. Most of the stuff that I've seen translated into English are mistranslations. That, again, doesn't mean that they're a benign actor, but it still is a significant difference if you're engaged in a geopolitical rivalry or if you're actually looking for the full destruction of the other side. And I think what we have seen over the course of the 45 or so years that the Islamic Republic has been in place is that, yes, it was very, very radical, quite irrational, perhaps early on in some of its actions. But that has significantly changed, and it is actually a very calculating, very ruthless actor, and it has been for quite some time, but it really does put its own interest ahead of everything else. And right now, its interest is to be able to actually manage to get to some sort of an agreement with the West, some variation of the JCPOA, which would mean that it would give up the pathways to a nuclear weapon, and that this is something that is of far greater importance to it than being able to come across or look as tough as some of its partners in the region wants it to be. I mean, we should keep in mind that Tehran is being quite criticized by the Houthis, by some Iraqi militias, for being too weak, not being aggressive enough, taking too many blows and not responding.
You mean in the last days and weeks they've been criticized?
Oh, even before that. I mean, certainly that has intensified in some ways, but even before that, particularly the Houthis, whose relationship with Iran is, of course, very different than relationship Iran has with Hezbollah or even Hamas. They've actually been quite openly critical of Iran and taken a pleasure in actually being seen as the one that actually is opposing Israel and kind of stealing that thunder away from the government in Iran. And I think if one has a deeper understanding of that, then what they're doing now is not as bewildering or perplexing, because it actually does fit a pattern, which is, yes, they're definitely opposed to Israel. They are doing everything they can to undermine Israel just as much as Israel is doing everything it can to undermine Iran, but they're not looking for a fast track to suicide. They're not looking to destroy everything they have just for the sake of being able to throw a few punches at Israel. That's just not their modus operandi. And I think also another thing that further gives credence to this is that they're kind of hiding behind the idea that there might be a ceasefire that would give them an off-ramp so that they wouldn't have to retaliate, mindful of the fact that they spoke a tough game after the assassination of Haniyeh in Tehran. The reality is no one in the region, and frankly, hardly anyone outside of the Beltway, believe that this ceasefire process actually has any legs. This is increasingly looking like the rest of the Israeli-Palestinian talks of the last 20 years, in which there was a lot of motion without movement, and increasingly is becoming a political cover for the status quo rather than actually an instrument to change the status quo. Tehran fully understands that, yet it hides behind that and is not responding, saying, well, they want to give a chance to the ceasefire talks. I think that makes it very, very clear how disinclined they are in getting into a direct blow with Israel. That does not mean that they will not retaliate one way or another, but they seem to believe that Netanyahu is setting a trap for them. Netanyahu wants them to respond ferociously so that he has a pretext for further escalation, and they want to avoid that.
It's interesting that you seem to frame it as they don't want this to escalate because they want the possibility of renewed rapprochement with the West. I guess two other potential explanations that I've heard are A, just that they're weak compared to Israel, and that what you see in pro-Israel discourse is that Israel is just so completely bamboozled them, has so much access inside Iran that they're terrified of what Israel could do to them. And then the other thing I hear, which is kind of different, is that they're very actually optimistic. They basically believe that Israel has gotten itself in a situation in Gaza that it's never going to extricate itself, and that actually time is on their side because basically Israel is going to be in its own version of Vietnam or Algeria or whatever in Gaza for a long time, and maybe the West Bank too. And so they can just afford to basically let Israel stew in its own juices. So I'm curious what you think of those two ideas.
I think there's truth in all of those ideas. If you take the last one first, certainly the Iranians do believe that time is on their side. They're looking at how Israel is viewed now internationally, and one had to be blind not to recognize the dramatic decline of Israel's standing everywhere in the world, except for a few spots in the West and in Europe. But even in Europe, it's definitely suffering. Take a look at the difference between now and the fall of 2022. Or 21, when was it? When you had the regime in Iran brutally suppressing the people there, the massive protests for women's rights, and the massive mobilization on social media, a lot of it manipulated, but nevertheless, really revealing how brutal the regime in Iran could be and how isolated it became, particularly in Europe, for instance. Its standing was almost as low as it was in the early years after the revolution. Fast forward 2 years now, and you have resolution against resolution introduced against Israel. You have Latin American countries breaking relations with Israel. You have a massive boycott against American companies for supporting Israel in the Middle East that actually is costing them tremendously. So on the one hand, yes, absolutely. They have been playing the long game all along. And they believe that, mindful of how Israel is undermining its own credibility and standing, that this is furthering their strategy of playing it cool, strategic patience, focus on the long game instead of the short game. At the same time, I think there's some truth in the earlier explanation. Yes, without a doubt, Iran is weaker than Israel. There's no doubt about that. If there was a direct confrontation, particularly mindful of the fact in such a confrontation, the Israelis would be able to get American firepower involved, the Iranians clearly would be losing that war. And precisely because they're not irrational, not suicidal, contrary to the Washington conventional wisdom, they're not going for that. I don't think that necessarily means that they will not retaliate. The challenge that they're faced with is, how do you retaliate, restore some semblance of deterrence, inflict some cost on Israel without providing the Israelis with the pretext of further escalation or dragging the US into the war? That's the challenge they're faced with. It's not that they can't retaliate or that they're too afraid of retaliating. Is, how do you finesse such a retaliation so it doesn't end up becoming a conflict that you don't want, just a much more limited conflict in which you restore deterrence? And in some aspects, I think both Hezbollah and Iran have already changed the game. You know, just a couple of years ago, Israel could, with more or less impunity, strike Lebanon, strike Syria, with no real consequences. Now you have a situation in which every time Israel does this, Hezbollah may strike back at Israel, deep inside of Israel, at military targets that the Israelis didn't think that Hezbollah would be able to strike. And we've seen through the Iranian attack in April that they have the ability to get through the David Sling, the Arrow 1, the Arrow 2, the Iron Dome. So Israel is not invulnerable. So in the context of where is the deterrence balance, Israelis are clearly stronger, but Israel has far greater vulnerabilities now than it did before it has revealed because of the new capabilities that Iran has. And this goes back to the first answer. Iran has these capabilities, has provided them to Hamas and Hezbollah precisely because it has played the long game. Take a look at Hezbollah's capabilities today compared to 2006. Even in 2006, their usage of drones and other things was a bit of a game changer, and the Israelis did not perform particularly well in that war. Now, their capabilities today, their arsenal of rockets and even more sophisticated weaponry is far greater today than it was back then. So technology has even the playing field somewhat precisely because of this game of strategic patience that they have been playing. And let me just mention a couple of numbers there. The Iranians have had about 2,000 people killed in Syria since 2011. Two-thirds of them have been Afghan recruits. About 600 of them have been IRGC soldiers, and some of them quite senior. For a force of 300,000, for them to lose 600 over the course of 10 years is not a big deal. They can win the numbers game because of the massive numbers they have, which Israel does not in the same way. Same thing is for Hezbollah. Hezbollah has lost about 400 soldiers since October 7th. That's not an insignificant number, but they have somewhere between 100 and 150,000. So there's a degree of confidence also that the long game has put them in a position in which they don't have to overreact to every transgression or retaliate in such a way that actually scuttles the apple cart in the same way, so to say, and pushes them further and further away from being able to play a more patient long game.
Help us understand what just happened very recently, where I guess Hezbollah was about to launch these attacks on these Israeli military bases. Israel attacked the rocket launchers and seemed to be effectively knocked a lot of them out. And then the New York Times started reporting that basically things were all calming down. How does that make sense from Hezbollah's perspective? They didn't actually manage to retaliate. If the need is to restore deterrence, how could they have restored deterrence? Does it just mean they're going to basically now try something else? Why wouldn't that escalate things that they were basically humiliated again, even after one of their top guys was assassinated and then they were preemptively attacked?
So the accounts differ tremendously between what Hezbollah says happened and what Israel says happened. And I would be skeptical of both accounts. I mean, you have some Israelis saying that about 6,000 rocket launchers were taken out. Others who are pointing out that two-thirds of the rocket launchers that were used in the attack were taken out, which could actually push down the number all the way down to 40 to 50 rocket launchers. So it's very unclear what happened on that front. Moreover, was this a very precise strategy by the Israelis in which they were actually targeting the specific ones, or was it that they actually did not know exactly which ones were being used? Clearly, Israel had intelligence that there was an attack coming. Did they know exactly from where? Did it? If so, why did it not manage to prevent some of those strikes more effectively? Because what we have seen is there was a large number of drones that essentially neutralized the Iron Dome, but there was a large number of rockets that made it through to Israeli military sites. The degree of damage is unknown. Hezbollah says that it was significant. They're going to come out with details. I have no idea. But part of the reason why we don't know is because the Israeli side issued a censorship, a military censorship, in which Israeli media was not allowed to report on the exact damage. The murkiness of the situation allowed both sides to declare victory. Israel being able to say that it managed to take out everything and then dismiss any damage because no one is being able to report on it anyway. Hezbollah being able to say that they managed to get deep into Israeli territory. And as a result, they have now at least finished the first phase, and now they're waiting to see what the reaction from Israel's side is going to be, and then use that to decide whether to go further or to leave it where we are right now. And they're pointing out that so far there's not been a major retaliation by Israel, and then celebrating that as some degree of deterrence being restored. I don't think deterrence is going to really be restored. In fact, we're seeing now that both sides are hitting each other deeper in their own territories than they ever have been before. But what I think has happened is that we're no longer in a scenario in which it is more or less cost-free for the Israelis to strike, because Hezbollah and Iran have the ability to strike back, have the ability to be able to penetrate deep into Israel, go through the air defenses. So that doesn't necessarily deter Israel, but it changes the calculation because every time something like this happens, there will be some sort of a cost for Israel. And it's not entirely predictable what that will be. In all of that, however, there's some criticism, both in Lebanon and certainly among some hardliners in Iran, that Iran and Hezbollah have just completely changed their strategy in a way that they're not viewing very favorably. The Iranians used to have a strategy that they called simulated irrationality. They wanted their decision making, their potential responses to an attack to be unknown and incalculable. Think of Nixon's madman theory. If the other side cannot figure out exactly how you're going to respond, that actually provides a degree of deterrence. For the last couple of years, it's very interesting to see how they have shifted. Now they're very much emphasizing that they are going to be logical, that they're going to be precise, they're going to act with precision, that they're not going to seek escalation. They're very much discarding any notion of irrationality and trying to come across as rational as possible, which then makes them more calculable. And in the argument of some of the hardliners, deprives them of a layer of deterrence that they enjoyed earlier on.
Just going back to your suggestion earlier, it may not be correct to say that Iran wants to destroy Israel. So we have a question from Hillel Schenker who asks, why do some Iranian leaders use the rhetoric of wanting to destroy and eliminate Israel if they don't mean it, which only serves to build Israeli and American support against Iran?
It's a very good question. It's a very important question. And I think part of the reason for that is we tend to forget that the two sides speak almost entirely to their own audiences and seem to either be oblivious, negligent, or dismissal of what the impact will be on the other side. If you take a look more carefully what senior leaders in Iran have been saying, it's mostly been arguments that they predicted that what they call the Zionist entity will collapse, that it will not be able to survive, rather than necessarily saying that this is what the Iranians are going to cause or achieve, but rather that it's going to happen on its own because of internal contradictions, because of other weaknesses, etc., etc. But you also have rhetoric coming out that is much, much more aggressive than that. Over here, we tend to immediately find those more aggressive points of rhetoric and then highlight them and be very dismissive of other things that have happened or have been said or have been done. So for instance, if Iran was really looking for the destruction of Israel, blindly, almost singularly pursuing a nuclear weapon would make more sense. And it would absolutely make no sense to sign the JCPOA that blocked all of Iran's pathways for a nuclear weapon. So those who want to essentially understand Iran by only reading the most harsh and aggressive and venomous rhetoric coming out of there, which is coming out, no doubt, have to also at the same time then explain why then does Iran do these other things that are not compatible with that type of a rhetoric. I think our approach should be to be very cautious, not dismiss some of the harsh rhetoric, but always check and see how is the rhetoric corresponding with their actual actions. And I think in the case of Iran, this is actually more important than with other cases, because already from the very beginning of the Islamic Revolution, on this specific issue, the Iranians decided to adopt a dual policy, one in which they call their rhetorical policy and one that they call their operational policy. So in the beginning of the revolution, they used the most venomous rhetoric against Israel and wanted to really take on the leadership of the Israeli-Palestinian issue and transform it into an Islamic cause. But at the same time, they wanted to avoid getting directly entangled with Israel because they actually had common geopolitical interests. Iran was at war with Saddam Hussein. The Israelis were actually helping Iran at the time by providing weapons, technology, spare parts, etc. So they adopted an operational policy in which they did very little and avoided getting directly entangled, while they adopted a rhetorical policy that made it look as if they were at the vanguard of opposing Israel and standing up for the Palestinian cause because it was such an important Islamic cause. I interviewed, I don't know if we spoke about this last time I was on, Peter, so forgive me if I repeat this.
Okay.
But I interviewed a senior Iranian official who had a lengthy conversation with Khomeini about this issue, trying to figure out exactly what his thinking was on how Iran should position itself vis-a-vis Israel. And Khomeini's argument was that Iran should only oppose Israel on a rhetorical level, which is the third circle. At the second level, the middle circle, it should be Arab states that are bordering Israel. And at the core of it should be the Palestinians themselves. Iran should never make itself a frontline state against Israel, was Khomeini's argument at the time, because again, the geopolitical interest did not warrant that. It actually went against that. But the ideological interest of coming across as being the leader of the Islamic world, et cetera, necessitated in their calculation the adoption of this type of rhetoric against Israel that left the impression that they were on the vanguards against Israel and for the Palestinians, when in reality, they actually kept quite a distance. This is part of the reason why Arafat was so infuriated with the Iranians, because they really thought that the Iranians were going to come in with massive financial support for the Palestinians. And that never actually happened in the 80s.
And do you think Hamas similarly felt betrayed that Iran didn't act after October 7th?
I think that's a very interesting parallel. Yeah, I mean, we know now that even Haniyeh didn't know anything about October 7th. The Iranians didn't know either. There's some reports that said that Hamas went to Tehran and they really wanted Iran and Hezbollah to get involved. But that was just not on the agenda of Iran or Hezbollah. And again, if they wanted a direct confrontation with Israel, they had now almost 11 months of opportunities to do so. And we've seen quite the opposite. And again, I think we have to keep one thing in mind. The distance between Hamas and Iran is very significant at times. Historically, Hamas, as you know, emerged out of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, very anti-Shiite, particularly Yassin himself was very skeptical of the Iranians, sided with Saddam Hussein in the late 1980s, and it really wasn't much of a common thread between them. It's only after his death, ironically, after Israel assassinated him in 2004, that you started to see a rapprochement between them. And then they had a big falling out over Syria, of course, as well, and that's been patched up. But the relationship between Hamas and Iran is nowhere near the type of organic relationship that exists between Iran and Hezbollah.
You mentioned that Iran calls Israel the Zionist entity. They're not the only people who've called Israel. Can you explain? I've never quite understood this. What's the point of calling it the Zionist entity and not just calling it Israel?
It's a good question, and I'm only speculating here because I actually didn't engage deeply on that specific issue. But I would suspect that it's a way of delegitimizing Israel by not actually recognizing what Israel called as itself, by calling it something else, something that in their view is derogatory because Zionism is seen as an imperialist, racist ideology, calling it an entity rather than a state and a country. This is part of their delegitimization campaign against Israel. And then politically, I have to say, it's very, very uncommon for any Iranian politician to actually use the word Israel. It would be costly for them to do so.
Interesting. So we have a question about the Iranian rapprochement with Saudi Arabia that the Chinese helped to broker, and where you think the Iranian-Saudi relationship stands and how that is impacting the U.S. effort to broker a normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia.
It really is quite fascinating, the Saudi-Iranian rapprochement that actually has survived so far and is progressing. And I think it's a recognition on both sides for their own reasons that this conflict that they had between them, which has not been resolved, but has now been put into a framework in which it can be managed, is to the benefit of both. From the Saudi side, it's because at the end of the day, MBS wants to succeed with his 2030 plan. Yemen ended up becoming a huge disaster and costly for him. His earlier radicalism and rather recklessness has been tempered. And he's realized some of the realities and recognized that he needs to find some ways to minimize conflicts with the Iranians in order for him to achieve his larger objectives. And his calculation, probably quite true. If he does so,
you mean the relation with Yemen is because Iran has leverage over the Houthis and he can help keep Yemen calm for Saudi Arabia? Or just help me understand the relationship there.
Well, partly because the Saudis believe that Iran has leverage with the Houthis. And it's not so much that they have leverage with the Houthis, but they have provided the Houthis with weapons and technology. And at a minimum, he could get them to cease doing that. I think the Saudis kind of scored an own goal by making such a big deal out of Iran being close to Houthi and ended up becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy. I mean, even earlier narratives in Saudi Arabia, it's only until about 2010 or so that they started referring to the Houthis as Shias, which is also not accurate. But that's part of when they were trying
But
to
why isn't it?
portray the
Aren't they a type of Shia?
they're a branch of it, but it's interesting. I remember a senior Iranian official told me that he didn't know that the Houthis actually adhere to a branch of Shiism until 2011. So it's not as if, I mean, this entire idea of trying to understand the region based on Sunni,
Right,
Shia, etc., is at times extremely comical. But the
right.
Saudis scored a bit of an own goal by really playing up the idea that the Iranians are so close to the Houthis. This was done in a way to delegitimize the Houthis, of course, within Yemen. It backfired because it actually gave the Iranians an opening to strengthen their relationship with the Houthis. And they also benefited from the false perception that they had so much leverage over the Houthis. Anyway, but it led to MBS recognizing that he needs to have calm in the region in order for him to achieve his economic objectives. And I think his calculation is not wrong in the sense that if he achieves his economic objectives, he will be in a much better position to be able to compete with Iran than if he engages with them right now. On the Iranian side, the calculation by and large, first of all, from the very beginning, the Iranians have been trying to find some sort of a equilibrium in the Persian Gulf in which Saudi Arabia and Iran are essentially the France and the Germany of the Middle East, at least of the Persian Gulf, and that they try to find some sort of a collaborative framework in which the two sides have, not necessarily on the same side, but they manage the region together rather than competing with each other. This has been a long-standing Iranian objective, but it became even more acute after Trump pulled out of the JCPOA. First of all, because they saw how Saudi Arabia was actually quite adept at manipulating Trump, which is not necessarily a high bar, but nevertheless, they were capable of doing so and could drag the US into a conflict with Iran in the way that the Iranians didn't want. But also because they recognized that without the JCPOA, without any confidence that the United States actually is capable of providing sustained sanctions relief to Iran. Because as you know, the Iranians signed the JCPOA, they adhered to it. Within 2.5 years, the US pulled out of it. And all of the sanctions plus more was reimposed on Iran. So they didn't want to play that game again. So they adopted a new strategy in which they were trying to neutralize sanctions rather than lift sanctions. That meant really intensifying economic collaboration and trade with regional states in which they could trade in their own currencies and bypass the US dollar. And they needed, of course, Saudi Arabia for that as well. At a minimum, they needed to make sure that there's some sort of a balance and peace with the Saudis in order for them to be able to improve their relations with Iraq and other states and trade with them. So they had a common interest in this. And that common interest has sustained. What they lacked was confidence and trust. That's where the Chinese came in. Both of them have a degree of confidence in the Chinese, but also recognizing that the other side cannot afford a conflict with China. So they both have an interest in adhering to the deal in order not to embarrass the Chinese and ruin their own relationship, or at least harm their own relationship with Beijing. And this is sustained for some time. Now, there is a significant worry in the region. And I have to say, I've spoken to a lot of states in the Arabian Peninsula and elsewhere that are very worried about the Saudi-Israeli normalization deal. It's not because they don't ultimately want to see some sort of a normalization with Israel. In fact, most of them still adhere to the 2002 Beirut Declaration. They're all willing to recognize Israel if Israel recognizes a Palestinian state. What they're not willing to do is to recognize Israel short of anything for the Palestinians for a variety of reasons. First of all, this will create massive tensions between themselves and their own population. Moreover, they believe, and I think they're right, it will further exacerbate the situation in the West Bank and Gaza and make it more likely that there will be more bloodshed and instability. And in that, they will have to take Israel's side against their own population's wishes, which can be very, very destabilizing. And on top of that, they're fearing that the Saudi-Israeli normalization will be turned into some form of a military alliance against Iran. And the pressure from the United States on these states to also recognize Israel in the same manner, without anything given to the Palestinians, will be immense after the Saudis have normalized. This is part of the reason why the Biden administration has really put a premium on normalization with Saudi Arabia, because they recognize if the Saudis do so, all of the other dominoes are likely to fall. And that's what many of these smaller states in the region are fearing. The Iranians definitely are opposed to that, but I don't think they're as nervous of that as some of the other states in the region are, because they're not going to normalize with Israel. They're not going to have some of those challenges. And they tend to believe, and perhaps they're wrong, that their relationship with Saudi Arabia will remain intact even if Saudi normalizes with Israel. So different calculations, who knows who's right or who's wrong. But one thing I think has been completely missed in Washington is how many states in the region are actually fearing a Saudi-Israel normalization because of the immediate consequences it will have on themselves.
One of the things that is still discussed a lot, I think, in Jewish circles when it comes to Iran is the Iran and Hezbollah, I think, as far as we know, role in the attack on the Jewish Cultural Center in Argentina in 1994. It stands out as an attack which was on a Jewish communal center rather than even an Israeli embassy or something like this. And so I'm curious how you understand what we know about Iran and Hezbollah's role in that and what the motivations were and what it says about their relationship, not just with Israel, but with Jews globally.
So, if I'm not mistaken, there was a Mossad report that came out, I think about 2 or so years ago, that kind of dismissed, or perhaps dismissed is too strong a word, but kind of moved away from the theory that Iran and Hezbollah was behind it. But prior to that, that was clearly the belief. I remember an advisor to Rabin told me that attack occurred only weeks after there had been a deep attack by Israel inside of Lebanon. And they interpreted as a message by Hezbollah and Iran that if you strike deep inside of Israel, then some Jewish community center around the world may end up becoming the target. And that completely was a game changer, he told me, because there's no way Israel can be protecting every Jewish community center around the world. Now, I have to say, I haven't followed that issue as close just to see exactly what the evidence or what the basis was for Mossad to start questioning that. I know others have questioned it and looked at the evidence and saying that this was more of a theory than a clear-cut case by them. But if we set that aside, there has been attacks by the Iranians and Hezbollah, at least against Israeli targets, not necessarily Jewish targets, but Israeli targets, soft targets, tourists, etc., around the world. We saw one case was it 2011 or so, in which there was a terrorist attack against Israeli tourists in Bulgaria. There had been an attempt against Israeli tourists in Cyprus just weeks before. This followed Israeli assassinations of Iranian scientists. And I think it is a fair theory to believe that this was part of the dirty war that was taking place between Israel and Iran at the time, in which the Israelis were assassinating Iranian scientists inside of Iran. The Iranians were trying to replicate that by assassinating Israeli diplomats and military attaches in various countries, in Kenya, Tanzania, in India, in Thailand, largely failed because the Israeli security was just so impenetrable. And as a result, they shifted towards focusing on more soft targets. After that, however, there were no more assassinations by Israel inside of Iran for a couple of years against senior Iranian scientists. That did start again, of course, with the one that occurred a couple of years ago. But there has been a dirty war between the two sides. And I do believe that the Iranians have targeted more so Israeli soft targets than necessarily Jewish, meaning community centers, etc. That, I think, is a bit of a question mark. It may be so, but again, I don't recall the details of that Mossad report that put some question marks around that.
I wanted to turn the conversation to the debate inside the United States and inside the foreign policy establishment. There's obviously you've been involved for quite a number of years, and Quincy's involved now in an effort to change U.S. policy and change the nature of a foreign policy establishment that's basically, in both parties, even Donald Trump notwithstanding, has a kind of hawkish default mechanism and an interventionist or quasi-imperial one. And there's obviously, specifically on Israel and Palestine, there's a lot of evidence that inside the Democratic Party, ordinary people want a very different policy. And yet I'm just continually struck by how marginal it still seems that people who want to reorient American foreign policy in a fundamental way are when it comes to actually staffing key positions in either party. Do you think that with Kamala Harris, there is likely to be any kind of shift in the worldview from the one that we've seen under Joe Biden?
It's a great question, Peter, and I hope I could be more optimistic. But let me put it this way. What we have seen so far is a variation inside of the Beltway in which some politicians, some administrations have essentially recognized how problematic a lot of American foreign policy has been But their analysis has essentially been that the core of it is still good and necessary. Unfortunately, there's been some excesses. And all you need to do is to avoid the excesses, and then you'll be fine. That's how far the analysis has gone. And I'm talking here is primarily the broader grand strategy of the United States, liberal hegemony, in which we believe that we have to dominate key parts of the world. And if we don't, chaos and anarchy will ensue, and our own security will be in peril. So you have those who are essentially saying that's not necessarily a problem. We just have to be a little bit more modest in the way we do it. We have to do away with the forever wars or the regime change wars. But other than that, it's a pretty solid and successful grand strategy, not recognizing what I think, at least from the Quincy Institute, we believe is the case, which is that if you're trying to dominate more or less every critical corner of the world all the time, you will end up being at war somewhere all the time. And that's why we have these endless wars. It's a direct consequence of this strategy. Now, it's interesting to see that some people who have left the Obama administration have taken that leap beyond that, reaching pretty close to where Quincy is, in which, for instance, Ben Rhodes has written that the United States has to give up on the idea that American leadership equates American hegemony, and pursue a strategy that is much, much more prudent, that is no longer at its core the pursuing of liberal hegemony around the globe. But people inside the Beltway, even if you actually have quite a few people inside the bureaucracy have recognized this, you're not seeing sitting government officials going that far. At best, they're just trying to temper and have more of a primacy light type of an approach rather than a more significant paradigm shift away from primacy and liberal hegemony and towards a much, much more militarily restrained grand strategy. I do personally think, however, that this is a process and that this is a very significant step that has taken already. I would like it to go faster, but I do believe that we will increasingly see politicians also taking that leap forward and away from primacy as a whole and shifting towards another grand strategy. And I think this will happen particularly mindful of the fact of where the younger American generation is on this issue. And I think we've talked about that in the past as well, that, you know, if you're a young American today, you have very, very different views about the foreign policy of the United States historically. You recognize that you're likely going to have a lesser standard of living than your parents. And a very critical reason for that is the many wars that the United States has fought since the fall of the Cold War. I mean, we're talking about a generation that essentially has not seen a good war in their lifetime. They have to go all the way back to perhaps a Second World War to find one of those wars. I think Ukraine kind of changed that a little bit. And for a brief period of time, there was this massive restoration of confidence in Washington that we're once again the good guys, because they tend to view the world in those type of terms. I do not. But someone else had done something really, really horrible, such as invading Ukraine, which of course is completely a violation of international law and should be condemned. And that necessitated the United States getting back into its primacy role. And I think we saw that very clearly with President Biden. Just take a look at him withdrawing from Afghanistan, giving a speech about this is the end of forever wars and the end of regime change wars. And look at what they were saying at the DNC. Look at what Biden himself was saying subsequent to that. He was again quoting Madeleine Albright that America is the indispensable nation. All of this type of exceptionalist talk that paves the way for a primacy grand strategy.
So you mentioned that there are some people in the bureaucracy who take a different point of view, but that the people at the decision-making folks generally don't. Do you think it's because they're of a particular generation with a certain set of experiences? Or obviously, some people have long suggested that the military-industrial complex just basically means that people, when they're not in government, are working for defense contractors or foreign governments, or they're working in some way for people who have an interest in a more aggressive foreign policy. And what, if any, role are pro-Israel groups playing in that as well? So how do you disentangle the reasons that there's still this discrepancy, especially given that we've had election outcomes, right? Obama beating Clinton and then McCain, or Donald Trump beating Jeb Bush, which show that there's some political utility in taking a more anti-interventionist position.
Absolutely. So I think, again, there's a little bit of truth in almost all of those explanations. There is definitely a generational gap, but it's not enough because at the end of the day, the entire infrastructure of organizations, institutions in Washington are such that you may come here as a young person with a very different perspective. But if you actually want to make a career,
Right.
you have to conform. You have to conform because there's no other way for you to be able to excel. And even if you, throughout your career, even may become privately more committed against the approach, you cannot say this very publicly because you will not be able to confirm for your next position in a Senate hearing. So you have an incentive structure that is very, very well ingrained that doesn't allow that. That's one of the reason why you see a lot of young people come to this town, figure out what the deal is, and then either sell out, keep quiet, or go into academia and leave Washington, D.C. This is part of the reason why we created Quincy. We wanted to make sure that there was an institution large enough so that you actually could have a sitting bench of people with a different perspective that could make a career, could make a living. They didn't have to sell out and be available to go into government and at the same time make a career and pursue those ideas. Prior to Quincy, there were places within think tanks that you could do so, but it was very limited. Quincy has enabled a career path to be able to pursue a different policy and argue for it energetically, unapologetically in Washington. That simply did not exist before our existence, I would say. In terms of where the pro-Israel, it depends on what you mean by pro-Israel, of course, but if you take some of the much more hawkish, perhaps pro-Likud organizations like FDD, etc., they're tripling down on American primacy. You could see how fearful they were about a pivot to Asia, because essentially if you pivot to Asia and you reduce your military presence in the Middle East, reduce the strategic significance of it, then suddenly the United States would be more amenable to various types of compromises in the region and not see it as it being a costly but not costly enough of a strategic cost to constantly come to Israel's aid when Israel were doing things, escalatory things in the region. But rather cleverly, you also seen that how they managed to kind of shift that by essentially saying competition with China is not just going to take place in the South China Sea. It's going to take place in the Middle East. It's going to take place in Africa. So if you want to beat China, you have to triple down on the Middle East. You have to be even more militarily present, et cetera, et cetera. So there's always a clever pathway towards doing more of what we've always done in terms of militarism that can be found and that can be justifying these things. But that's where I think you see most of those groups falling in, because they recognize that American primacy, American military engagement on a very large scale in the region is necessary for the United States to sustain a very, very pro-Likud position in the US government itself.
Right. I would imagine, this is not something I've heard you talk about much, but I would imagine that the pressures to show that you have establishment views and that your views are not heterodox are even more intense for people who don't come from a conventional background, who may not be white guys who look like Anthony Blinken or Jake Sullivan. And I'm just curious, I mean, I don't think I've ever asked you this before, how much racism you have experienced in Washington as you make the foreign policy arguments that you've been making over these years.
I don't know. I don't know if I would call it racism, to be completely frank with you, because whatever challenges and problems has been faced there, I think is incomparable to the challenges that, you know, African American community has been enduring in this country, or Jewish American community has endured in many places, perhaps not as much in this country. But without a doubt, you are seen as suspicious. You can say the same thing as someone else, but because of your background, the guards are always up in certain quarters. I think that's just the reality you have to deal with. I think if you end up being too worked up about it, it actually ends up becoming a far greater obstacle than it needs to be. And I would say that Quincy's success in many different ways is a testament that there are ways to make significant headway with this perspective, because at the end of the day, in Washington, we may be treated by some as if we're coming from a very, very odd standpoint and we don't understand American interest, etc., which I think is really laughable, to be frank with you. I'll do a challenge for everyone on this list. Go and read some of the think tank reports that are produced by mainstream think tanks in Washington, D.C. Most often, there's not even a section describing what is the U.S. interest. But when there is, the list is like 5 pages long. And it's just almost everything you possibly can think of is apparently a vital American interest. And at the very bottom, they have a catch-all variable that is called standing by our allies. So whatever is not caught up in the first 5 pages is then caught up with that last item, because then everything that our allies believe are our interests are also suddenly our interests. And that's when you end up in a situation in which you constantly have to intervene, because everything apparently is a vital interest. Well, when you define vital interest that way, you have actually made sure that you have not defined it. But anyway, the point I'm trying to make is that we may be treated by some in Washington like that. But when you go outside of Washington and you talk to Americans throughout the country, instinctively, Americans, in my view, tend to have an understanding that, yes, precisely because we really don't like other countries intervening in our affairs, it is quite likely that other peoples also are not particularly excited about us intervening in their affairs. They also understand that if we're constantly trying to rule the world militarily, we will end up being in wars. And perhaps they don't have a grand strategic perspective of it, but they have very clear views about what happened in Libya, what happened in Iraq, and that this is not something that was to the benefit of the United States or to the benefit of the region. And this is part of the reason that we've now seen the last couple of presidential cycles. If you're taking those positions, that's actually good politics. We have not reached a point in which you say those things in the campaign and then you do those things as president. But we've definitely reached a point in which it's clearly the better rhetoric politically to adopt, rather than using the type of a language that existed back in the 1990s, in which essentially we were the solution to every problem in the world. And there was absolutely nothing we could not achieve through our military.
Do you think that Phil Gordon, who's Kamala Harris's top foreign policy advisor, based on what we know about him, his background, and what she has now said in the campaign, is in a different place in any way than Biden and the people around him?
Yes, I would say. I mean, first of all, Phil, I think, is a very, very thoughtful guy. And those who haven't read his book called, I think, Losing the Long War, it's a very solid analysis and recommendation explaining why the regime change policies of Washington have always been a failure. He had a couple of great pieces back in 2016 or so in Politico as well, in which he compared the intervention in Egypt, Libya, Syria, various degrees of it, and pointed out that whatever the US did, it actually had very little impact on the outcome on the ground. We had a capacity of making things worse, but not really being able to achieve our objectives. And it kind of pushed him towards the position of doing less is better than doing more. Now, I haven't had conversations with him for some time, so I don't know how Russia's invasion of Ukraine may have impacted his thinking. As you know, not only is he an expert on the Middle East, but also on Europe. And that's actually how he started off his career. He wrote a dissertation on French foreign policy. So I don't know if that has changed his thinking a lot on this, but I think he would come in, if it's the same Phil Gordon that wrote those books, that experienced these last 11 months of Gaza, and then we set aside Ukraine for a second, then I have a hard time imagining that he would come out of that being more confident about the US's ability to decide outcomes, to use its military to be able to change realities on the ground than he was before. But I think we're going to be in a phase now in which there will likely be an effort by him to perhaps play down some of those views, at least during the campaign. Not walk away from them, but perhaps play down on them a little bit. But even if that were to happen and he were to come in, become national security advisor, it would take a tremendously experienced and strong president to be able to push for the type of changes that are needed to really re-steer this massive ship of American foreign policy. And I think Biden tried to do that, and he did that in Afghanistan. But part of the reason why Biden botched up the withdrawal is because of the indecisiveness and the disputes that existed within his own administration. Only days and weeks up until that final decision was made. A lot of time was lost in preparing a much better withdrawal if there had been a much clearer decision earlier on in the administration. But precisely because this is such a tough thing for American presidents to do, apparently, to actually withdraw from a completely losing war, we ended up in a scenario in which the outcome, of course, was quite devastating on the ground. And that's a president that is, I think at this time, quite known for not listening to others. I don't think Harris comes in with a type of foreign policy experience to be able to act decisively and strongly on these issues early on. So I would have rather tempered expectations of what will happen in the early stages of her presidency if she were to win the elections.
Yeah. Tomorrow, we'll do our first Ask Me Anything for premium subscribers. So I hope folks will consider joining and participating. And I guess, Trita, just the last question in the last couple of minutes we have. It seems to me that there is a very bitter debate that exists within Iranian Persian diaspora circles that I know that you've been caught up in various ways. And I'm just curious if you can help us understand a little bit why there seem to be such strong voices among Persian Americans or in other parts of the world who take such a hawkish view as opposed to the one that you historically have advocated, which is obviously it's very critical of the regime, but is also against a war with Iran.
Thank you for asking that question, because I'm happy to get an opportunity to clarify that, because I can understand if one coming from the outside and just take a little bit of a look of Persian Twitter, it's not a pretty picture. But let me first start off by saying this. The position in favor of a more diplomatic approach to Iran avoiding war was clearly the majority position within the Iranian American community. Roughly 75–80% of the community supported the JCPOA, for instance, and were very organized in favor of it. Much of that changed, though, after the US withdrew from the deal, and then we saw the regime also getting much, much more aggressive, even during the time of Rouhani, clamping down very aggressively against some protests. And then, of course, you saw what happened with the protest in 2022 over Mahsa Amini. One of the key things that happened there then is that a younger generation in Iran lost faith in the idea that reform and change from within actually was possible. That's part of the reason why those protests from the very beginning called for regime change. So the belief in reform that had been like the guiding star since 1997 when Khatami was elected, by 20 years later, people, by and large, not just the young people, had drawn the conclusion that it was a failure. It had not led to anything. And instead of it gradually opening Iran up, it ended up just sustaining a status quo. And I think to a very large extent, that is actually because the US withdrew from the JCPOA. If the JCPOA actually had been in place since 2015 and had been in place for 9 years, I think Iran would be in a very different position now. And the bet on reform actually would have worked out. But that wasn't the case. So now suddenly you had a situation in which a majority of Iranians, and I think I can comfortably say majority because we saw how few of them have been participating in the elections, stopped believing that reform is possible and want a regime change. That then directly translates into how the diaspora looks at it. Because as long as there's a theory of change, that something positive can come from within Iran, there was a willingness, however much people hated the regime, to give some space for that. Because those inside the country are the ones who are paying the consequences for it, so they should be deciding. But once they no longer believed in it, at least temporarily, then you can also suddenly see how winds inside of the diaspora moved in the opposite direction. And suddenly there was this support for regime change, more sanctions, to a certain extent war, but that was, I think, a fringe minority. Now we're in a situation in which that also has not worked out. And people inside the country are essentially having no theory of change. There's more apathy and disillusion than there is what it was 5 years ago, in which at least there was back then some sort of enthusiasm thinking that revolution could work. Now they concluded that it most likely will not work and will only make matters worse. But they also don't have much faith in reform. I mean, it's with less than 49% participation that Pezeshkian won the elections. And probably participation would have been even lower had the candidate on the other side not been such a nutcase hardliner as Jalili was. So I think you have a crisis inside the country in which there isn't optimism, there isn't a view of a path forward, and that then changes the dynamics in the diaspora as well, very directly. And I would say the diaspora, more than anything else, is not really a decision maker on any of these things at all, and perhaps that's a good thing. They're more than anything else reflecting what is happening inside the country.
Yeah, fascinating. And obviously some really interesting parallels with Jewish diaspora relationship with Israel. Trita, this was terrific as always. I always learn so much. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate being able to have a conversation with you all. Have a great day.
Take care.
Thank you.
Again, tomorrow we'll do our first of our Ask Me Anythings. That's for premium subscribers. I'm sorry. I feel like I use car salesman hawking different products in my newsletter, but I think it'll be fun. Anyway, I'm looking forward to it.